The sun hung low over the marble colossus of the Colosseum, a molten disk bleeding into the Roman sky. From the highest tiers to the lowest vaults, the air was thick with heat, incense, and anticipation. Tens of thousands of citizens pressed together, merchants, nobles, slaves, senators, breathing as one monstrous organism hungry for death. The scent of sweat, wine, and animal musk drifted through the arches, mingling with something darker, the faint metallic tang of old blood soaked deep into the sand beneath their feet. It was a place where the boundaries between ritual and madness blurred, where mercy was weakness and spectacle was a god. Beneath the chanting of the crowd, drums thundered like the heartbeats of a beast that had no soul, and when the gates below the emperor's seat groaned open, that beast began to feed. A naked man stumbled into the light, his chains rattling softly against the deafening roar of 50,000 throats. Above him, banners fluttered in crimson and gold. Below, the arena floor shimmered with the shimmer of heat and terror. From the shadowed corridor opposite, the lion emerged, slow, deliberate, its mane catching sunlight like a crown of fire. The crowd rose to its feet in ecstasy, their cheers drowning out the man's scream as the first spray of blood struck the sand. It was not horror they saw. It was entertainment, art, justice, and faith all fused into one intoxicating delirium. To be Roman was to watch, to cheer, to be cleansed through the suffering of others. And yet, this was only the surface of Rome's appetite. The arena was not just a stage for death. It was a reflection of the empire's soul, a place where cruelty became ceremony and humiliation became ritual. What unfolded here would go far beyond combat or punishment. The Romans would soon stage scenes so depraved, so unspeakably elaborate, that even historians centuries later would veil them in silence. These were not merely games, they were rehearsals for hell itself. Before we descend into this shadowed chapter of history, hit subscribe, because what you're about to uncover are the dark secrets of ancient Rome's most brutal arena shows, the ones that crossed every limit the human imagination could endure. Long before the Colosseum's towering arches became Rome's altar of death, the roots of its obsessions were already sinking deep into the soil of antiquity. The earliest Romans borrowed their ideas of ritual killing from the Etruscans, those shadowy predecessors who believed that blood appeased the spirits of the dead. In their funerals, slaves and prisoners were forced to fight to the death beside the graves of their masters, their blood seen as an offering to escort the departed into the afterlife. It was meant to be sacred, a grim but spiritual farewell. But something shifted when the Romans inherited this tradition. They stripped it of reverence and filled it with spectacle. What began as a private rite of mourning soon evolved into a public theater of violence, a spectacle where the gods were forgotten and only the crowd mattered. Death, once a solemn mystery, became a form of civic entertainment, a drug stronger than any incense that ever burned before Jupiter's altar. As Rome expanded its territories and filled its coffers with the spoils of conquest, the games mutated into something monstrous. The city's appetite for violence became insatiable, and emperors quickly learned to feed it. Julius Caesar staged the deaths of hundreds of gladiators at once to honor his father's memory. Later, under Augustus and Tiberius, the spectacles grew more frequent, more organized, more politically charged. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena was a coin of loyalty spent by rulers to secure the devotion of their restless masses. The formula was elegant in its cruelty: bread for the stomach, blood for the soul. As long as the people were fed and entertained, they would not question the corruption in marble halls or the wars fought on distant sands. The arena was not just a theater, it was a machine of control, a mirror through which power reflected its own divine justification. The architecture of that control was as precise as a military campaign. The amphitheater itself was designed not merely for viewing, but for domination. Every tier, every seat, every gate was calculated to create hierarchy. Patricians sat close to the sand, plebeians high above, slaves and women at the edges. The emperor presided at the center of it all, not only as ruler, but as God incarnate, deciding who would live or die with a mere flick of the wrist. And beneath the marble floors ran a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and holding cells where men waited in darkness to meet their end. Here, the moans of the condemned mingled with the growls of starving beasts, forming a chorus that the audience would never hear, but somehow always sensed, the hum of death pulsing beneath the city like a heartbeat that never stopped. For the Romans, violence was not a contradiction to civilization, it was its proof. To conquer was to rule was to punish, and to punish was to entertain. The line between justice and amusement disappeared until they became one and the same. The condemned were labeled as traitors, criminals, or slaves, their humanity erased so their agony could be consumed without guilt. Children were brought to watch their deaths as a lesson in Roman virtue, taught that courage was not in compassion but in indifference to suffering. The roar of the crowd became the moral compass of an empire that no longer believed in pity. To die screaming before 50,000 eyes was not tragedy. It was destiny. And yet, behind the grandeur and marble, there existed an invisible economy. The economy of death. Merchants dealt in flesh as casually as in grain or wine. Armies returning from conquest brought not just gold and silk but thousands of captives destined for the sand. The beasts that would tear them apart were shipped from every corner of the known world. Lions from Numidia, tigers from Parthia, crocodiles from Egypt. Even nature was enslaved for entertainment. In the arenas of Rome, man fought beast, beast devoured man, and sometimes man became the beast himself. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of animals slain in a single festival, their carcasses left to rot in the sun, the stench drifting through the city for days. But the crowds cheered louder, intoxicated by the scale, blinded by the grandeur, convinced that this excess proved Rome's divine favor. As the centuries turned, the games no longer required a reason. They ceased to be tributes to the dead or honors for the gods. They became Rome's heartbeat, a ritual of dominance that fed upon its own momentum. Each emperor sought to outdo the last, transforming cruelty into policy, perversion into patriotism. Senators sponsored executions to curry favor. Wealthy citizens staged miniature spectacles in private villas, their gardens transformed into miniature killing fields. Even the moralists who condemned the games could not look away. The allure of blood was stronger than philosophy. The poet Juvenal would later sneer that Rome had traded its voice for bread and circuses, but by then the truth was already too deep. Violence was no longer a distraction. It was identity. The crowd that once watched gladiators at funerals now watched them for pleasure. The empire that once feared barbarism now celebrated it. And soon, even the boundaries of combat would no longer suffice. Rome had seen men kill and die 1,000 ways. What it craved next was not death itself, but the artistry of cruelty, the transformation of suffering into performance. It would no longer be enough to watch a man die. He had to die beautifully, theatrically, with purpose and humiliation woven together like poetry. The sand would become a stage, the screams a score, and the human body the instrument of an empire's vanity. Beneath the gold and grandeur, beneath the cheers and the imperial decrees, a darker truth was forming, a truth that would one day swallow the empire itself. Rome had turned its thirst for power inward. The games no longer symbolized victory over enemies, they had become victory over conscience. And as the blood seeped deeper into the earth, staining the very foundations of its civilization, no one in the roaring stands realized they were watching not just the execution of men, but the slow, magnificent execution of Rome's own soul. In the earliest days of Rome's spectacles, the killing still pretended to have meaning. The air was filled with prayers and incense, and priests sprinkled the sand with consecrated wine before the first blow was struck, invoking the favor of Mars and the spirits of the dead. It was said that blood purified the earth, that every death restored balance between man and the divine. But as the centuries passed, those sacred words lost weight. What remained was the rhythm of the crowd, the smell of sweat, the pulse of drums that matched the heartbeat of thousands waiting for release from boredom or hunger. Religion had become theater, and theater had become a rehearsal for damnation. The men who died were no longer offerings to gods. They were currency, spent for applause. Their bodies were instruments of ecstasy, their screams the hymn of a civilization that had forgotten its own origin myths. The marble temples of Jupiter and Venus stood only a short walk from the amphitheaters, yet in the hearts of Romans, the gods were already changing shape, no longer carved from stone, but from the twisted beauty of suffering flesh. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. In the stands, women draped in silks whispered to each other about the symmetry of a fighter's muscles, the nobility of his wounds, the way sunlight caught the blood as it sprayed across the sand. Artists began sketching the dying, poets compared the arena's carnage to the ecstasy of love. It was here that Rome's lust and faith fused into one, where divine awe became erotic thrill. The audience no longer prayed for victory. They prayed to feel something deeper, darker, closer to the edge of the forbidden. The smell of incense was replaced by the stench of burning flesh, yet the crowd cheered louder, convinced that in watching death they were cleansing themselves of weakness. The ritual had devoured its purpose and replaced it with pleasure. The lifeblood of this machine was the gladiator's slave, prisoner, or condemned man reborn as a weapon for the amusement of his masters. In the ludus, the training schools that dotted the empire, men were stripped of names and pasts, reshaped into symbols of courage for a society that had long forgotten what courage meant. Behind the walls of those barracks, the smell of iron and sweat clung to the air like rot. Their muscles were honed through exhaustion, their skin hardened by lashes, their loyalty maintained through hunger and fear. To the spectators above, they were heroes. To the men who owned them, they were livestock. Contracts were drawn, wagers placed, and the value of a human life was measured not in dignity, but in the number of roars it could provoke from a crowd. Yet within this cruelty, paradox bloomed, a cruel romance between killer and killed, master and slave. Some gladiators became celebrities, their faces painted on pottery, their names whispered in taverns by those who envied the attention of women who adored them. For a few, survival brought a perverse kind of freedom, a chance to purchase their lives with blood. But for most, the glory was a mirage, shimmering over a pit of despair. Every fight was a slow suicide, staged for someone else's satisfaction. They were forced to smile when the emperor entered, to salute the man who held their fate between two fingers raised or turned. To die well was considered an art form, to beg for mercy was shameful. And when a man fell, his body dragged by hooks through the sand, another took his place, and the crowd's hunger did not dim for a heartbeat. The rebellion of Spartacus burned briefly against this darkness, a flash of dignity in a world built on degradation. But even his defiance was absorbed into the myth of the games. Rome crucified 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot beneath the sun as both warning and entertainment. The message was clear. Even rebellion could become spectacle. Every act of courage, every drop of blood, fed the empire's addiction to its own cruelty. When the appetite for combat dulled, Rome found new flavors in the suffering of those it deemed unworthy of even the honor of the sword. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, became a favorite performance, a moral sermon delivered through annihilation. Criminals, slaves, and foreigners were thrown naked into the arena, where cages opened and nightmares crawled out. Lions starved for days, bears chained and enraged, leopards painted in oils to gleam beneath the sun. The air would fill with a single, monstrous sound, a mixture of laughter and agony as bodies were torn apart before tens of thousands of spectators. The crowd called it justice, but justice had long ago become indistinguishable from appetite. To keep the novelty alive, the organizers turned execution into theater. Victims were dressed as characters from mythology, forced to reenact divine punishments. A man cast as Prometheus was chained to a rock while vultures pecked his flesh. A woman playing Dirce was tied to a bull and dragged until nothing remained but shreds of silk and bone. In one notorious show under Nero, a condemned prisoner was burned alive in the costume of Heracles, his screams echoing as the crowd chanted verses of the myth that justified his torment. The line between play and reality dissolved, pain became poetry, agony became choreography. The sand of the Colosseum was no longer merely stained, it was painted, layer upon layer, until it glowed red even when dry. The audience, meanwhile, learned to read suffering like an art form. The tilt of a head, the rhythm of a dying breath, the spray of arterial blood, all were cues in a performance that needed no script. Musicians played flutes and horns to accompany the dying, actors mimed joy as bodies burned. To the Romans, this was not barbarism. It was refinement, an evolution of cruelty into culture. Their civilization prided itself on order, on spectacle, on beauty, even in horror. They believed that by mastering death they proved their superiority over the savage world beyond their borders, never seeing that in their mastery they had become the savages themselves. If the crowd was the body of the spectacle, the emperor was its soul, a single man whose desires shaped the boundaries of permissible evil. Some rulers treated the games as political tools, others as mirrors of their own derangement. Under Caligula, the boundaries between governance and psychosis blurred completely. He ordered nobles to fight in the arena for refusing to applaud quickly enough, sentenced entire families to die together so their screams would harmonize, and once commanded that the stands themselves be sprinkled with the blood of citizens chosen by lot simply to remind Rome who ruled. The games ceased to symbolize justice or divinity. They became the emperor's dreamscape, a canvas for his cruelty. Nero followed, turning the spectacle into theater in every sense. He performed on stage as a singer, then stepped into the arena to preside over killings that blurred the line between art and sadism. For him, the death of others was part of his performance, proof that his voice could drown out even the cries of the dying. Later came Commodus, the emperor who believed himself Hercules reborn. He entered the arena dressed in lion skins, wielding gilded swords, slaughtering bound men and maimed animals for adoration. Senators were forced to cheer or face execution. Courtiers fainted not from horror but from exhaustion, forced to watch for hours as the ruler displayed his madness like a crown. Coins bore his image as a god of the games, a killer sanctified by the empire itself. By the time of Domitian, the shows had become a moral abyss masquerading as grandeur. Entire nights were dedicated to executions illuminated by torches soaked in human fat. Invitations were sent like letters to a banquet, and guests arrived dressed in white to better reflect the glow of burning bodies. The arena had ceased to be a place of contest. It had become an altar to one man's insecurities. And yet, Rome applauded. The empire's fate was sealed not by its enemies beyond the walls, but by the silence of those who watched and called it glory. There came a time when even slaughter could no longer satisfy the Roman imagination. The crowds had seen every wound, every death, every dismemberment the human body could offer, and they craved novelty, the mingling of violence with something more intimate, more profane. Thus were born the ludi obsceni, the obscene games, where the boundaries of entertainment dissolved entirely. In these shows, prisoners and slaves were forced into acts that blurred torture with lust, reenacting myths of divine seduction and punishment before roaring audiences. Naked bodies were arranged like sculptures, violated in rhythm with the music of flutes, their shame transformed into choreography. It was no longer enough to witness pain. The spectators demanded the theater of degradation, the stripping of humanity itself. Women, too, became part of the machinery of spectacle, not as spectators, but as subjects. Some were condemned for crimes as small as defiance, others for nothing at all, their only sin being beauty that had caught the wrong eye. They were forced to play roles in mythic dramas, where desire and destruction intertwined. Leda and the swan, Pasiphae and the bull, Europa and the bull god. Each act mirrored Rome's twisted theology, that domination was divine and submission sacred. The audience, flushed with excitement, convinced themselves they were watching allegory, not atrocity. But beneath the chants and music lay the unmistakable truth. Rome had turned perversion into prayer. Even children were not entirely spared. Some were used as symbols of innocence corrupted, cast into the arena to die beside their parents for moral instruction. The philosophers who dared speak against it described these events in guarded language, fearful that too much truth would invite the emperor's wrath. One writer recorded simply that the cruelty of our games surpasses the cruelty of war. Another, centuries later, would write that in Rome, sin became ceremony. The empire that claimed to civilize the world had made the destruction of innocence its greatest art. By the final century of the games, the spectacle had lost all pretense of morality or faith. The sand was no longer merely the stage, it was a graveyard churned by generations of agony. The amphitheaters that once echoed with the cheers of victory began to feel haunted. The smell of blood clung to the stone even when empty, as if the earth itself refused to forget. Those who walked through the tunnels beneath the Colosseum after the crowds dispersed said they could still hear whispers, the sighs of the condemned, the laughter of emperors, the wet scrape of chains. Rome had built its identity on conquest, but within those walls, it conquered its own humanity. The arena, once conceived as a celebration of divine order, had become the empire's confession. Every lash, every scream, every ritualized violation was a prayer to a god that no longer existed. The sand had absorbed so much blood that it ceased to be soil. It became memory, grain by grain recording the story of a people who mistook cruelty for greatness. And as the last lights faded after each spectacle, as the crowd drifted home through the marble streets, the night would settle over Rome like judgment itself. In that silence, the empire seemed eternal, but the truth was already written beneath its feet. No civilization that glorifies pain can escape becoming its own victim. By the height of the empire, cruelty was no longer the symptom of Rome's decay, it was the system itself. The spectacles that had once been spontaneous bursts of savagery became the empire's most meticulously organized industry. Beneath the Colosseum stretched a vast underworld of machinery, pulleys, cages, and corridors where slaves scurried through torchlit tunnels like ants in a hive built for slaughter. There were designated keepers of beasts, engineers who designed collapsing stages, physicians tasked not with healing but with ensuring that wounds looked more dramatic, and scribes who recorded every death for imperial archives. Bureaucracy had conquered morality. Killing became a ledger entry, its efficiency praised in reports read by senators over wine. It was an empire that worshipped control, and nowhere was that control more absolute than over life and death itself. The roar of the crowd was timed like a chorus, the appearance of lions synchronized with trumpets, the scent of blood masked by perfume sprinkled from silver censers. Death was choreographed with the precision of a ballet. The most infamous festivals were no longer celebrations. They were purges dressed as holidays. Under Emperor Titus, when the Colosseum was inaugurated in 80 CE, the games lasted for 100 straight days. Over 5,000 beasts were slain, and countless men perished in contests that defied all imagination. At dawn, the sand glistened with dew. By noon, it steamed with blood. Between fights, workers raked the ground smooth, spreading fresh sand to soak up the gore before the next performance. The arena floor was changed so often that the surface itself became symbolic, a mask of purity placed atop a mass grave. In one corner, musicians tuned their instruments while, in another, slaves carted away mangled limbs. The rhythm never stopped, even the dying seemed choreographed to fall on cue. By evening, the emperor smiled, and the people roared, drunk on the illusion that they were witnessing divine justice when in truth they were watching the slow ritual of national suicide. The machinery of death was as efficient as any army. From the moment a prisoner was condemned, his path to the arena followed a fixed route: registration, branding, confinement, selection. Wardens evaluated bodies like livestock, pairing opposites for maximum drama. A giant against a dwarf, a woman against a beast, an unarmed philosopher against a trained killer. Scripts were written for the day's events, complete with prologues and moral themes. Some executions were staged as moral lessons, others as jokes, and some purely as experiments in spectacle. There were specialists whose only task was to retrieve weapons from corpses without disrupting the next performance, and others who tended to the animals between killings, so the beasts would appear fresh and lively for the next round. The organization was horrifying in its calmness, an orchestra of annihilation conducted with bureaucratic grace. The audience, conditioned by decades of spectacle, no longer saw any of this as extraordinary. They arrived in festive attire, bringing food, drinks, and lovers, laughing between bouts of carnage as if attending a picnic. Children sat on their father's shoulders to gain a better view of a lion disemboweling a man. Senators debated politics while the condemned screamed below them. Philosophers wrote treatises praising the discipline of gladiators, claiming that by watching death one learned courage. The collective conscience of Rome had been replaced by an aesthetic, a fascination with suffering polished to the level of philosophy. The empire had discovered something more dangerous than brutality: indifference. And yet, amid this indifference, there were spectacles that transcended even the logic of entertainment. One such festival under Commodus lasted weeks, during which the emperor personally fought hundreds of opponents, men crippled or drugged beforehand to ensure his triumph. He slew ostriches with arrows tipped in gold and forced senators to applaud as he mocked the dying. In one grotesque display, he ordered decapitated heads to be placed on pedestals so he could strike them with clubs, laughing as blood splattered his gilded armor. Every blow he dealt was met with orchestrated cheers, every silence punished by the executioner's sword. The arena was no longer Rome's playground, it was its confessional, and its sins were applauded as virtues. But perhaps the darkest revelation lay not in the actions of emperors or executioners, but in the silence that surrounded them. Historians of the time wrote cautiously, veiling details beneath euphemism. Official records referred to festivities, pageants, or celebrations of virtue. The true horror was hidden behind language itself, a civilization erasing its conscience through the poetry of its own vocabulary. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover layers of sand stained almost black, discovering bones gnawed by lions, shackles fused by heat, remnants of burnt wood and bone evidence of rituals so obscene that even Rome's chroniclers dared not describe them. What was once called civilization now looked more like an autopsy. There were whispers, however, of those who could still feel shame. Certain philosophers, Stoics and early Christians alike, spoke of the arena as humanity's final descent, a place where man's divinity was mocked by his own creations. They wrote that to watch death for pleasure was to die in spirit long before the body expired. Yet their words were drowned in laughter, their warnings buried beneath applause. The empire had become addicted to its own decay. Each new emperor inherited the ghosts of the last, and each sought to drown them in fresh rivers of blood. Rome mistook horror for unity, cruelty for culture, and in doing so, ensured that its greatness would never outlive its guilt. In the end, even the audience began to change. They came not only for entertainment, but for purification. To witness the agony of others became a ritual of absolution, a cleansing of private sin through public blood. The amphitheater transformed into a temple of denial, and the emperor its high priest. When Christians were thrown to lions, when slaves were burned alive to illuminate night games, when mothers were forced to watch their sons butchered for the crowd's amusement, the spectators called it order, calling the cruelty a lesson in divine justice. The gods of Rome were no longer Jupiter or Mars. They were fear and hunger, endlessly fed yet never satisfied. And as centuries turned, those same gods turned against their worshippers. The empire that had enslaved continents found itself enslaved to its own shadow. The men who had cheered in triumph were now haunted by emptiness. The more they killed, the less they felt alive. The arenas fell quiet, not because mercy returned, but because the heart of Rome finally stopped beating. Beneath its marble streets and golden arches lay mountains of bones, anonymous, countless, unburied. The wind that once carried the chants of victory began to echo with the whispers of the dead. And in that echo, one could almost hear the prophecy that the Romans never believed, that no empire, however mighty, can build eternity upon the suffering of others. For when cruelty becomes culture, collapse becomes destiny. When the last echoes of the crowd faded, and the wind began to stir the empty tiers of the Colosseum, the arena stood like a wound that would never heal. The sand, once alive with the roar of beasts and the cries of men, lay still beneath a moon that turned every stone pale and ghostly. In that silence one could almost hear the breath of the dead, the countless voices swallowed by the cheers of a people who mistook cruelty for glory. The marble arches that had once glittered with imperial banners now crumbled in quiet surrender, vines creeping where emperors once sat. Rome's heart, once made of gold and iron, had decayed into dust and memory. The city that had called itself eternal found eternity only in ruin. The amphitheater became a mausoleum of its own pride, a place where the ghosts of victims and spectators mingled, indistinguishable at last, because in the end there was no difference between those who killed and those who watched. Centuries passed, and travelers from distant lands stood within those same arches, their footsteps echoing through corridors that once dripped with blood. They marveled at the architecture, the grandeur, the genius of Rome, but they did not feel what the stones remembered. They could not smell the fear or taste the smoke of burning flesh. They saw only beauty, not the cost of it. Yet beneath every layer of dust, the memory of suffering still clung like a whisper trapped in stone. the arena had become a mirror of humanity itself, majestic, intelligent, powerful, and utterly capable of horror. Each empire that followed would claim to be different, more civilized, more merciful, but the reflection never changed. Whether in the glare of a torch or the glow of a screen, mankind would always find a way to turn pain into spectacle. The ruins of Rome stand not as monuments to victory, but as confessions. They remind us that the line between progress and perversion is perilously thin, and that the same species that built libraries and laws also built theaters of death. Every civilization believes it is immune to the darkness of its ancestors, yet the hunger for spectacle still stirs in the human heart, wearing new faces, finding new arenas. The question that haunts us is not why Rome fell, but whether we have ever truly risen from its ashes. And so, as we leave the sand where blood once shone brighter than gold, remember what history tried to bury beneath stone in silence, that the cruelty of the crowd is never ancient. It merely waits for its next applause. Which of these horrors haunts you the most? Tell us below. And if you seek to uncover more of the dark truths history tried to hide, subscribe now, because the shadows of the past are never really gone, they're only waiting for us to look again.